This Week in Common Sense from November 18th through the 22nd, 2019. 5 pieces from thisiscommonsense.com.
No amendment should be bum rushed into the Constitution. And that's really the problem with what's going on with the Equal Rights Amendment. And we can debate other problems, but here was an amendment that was beaten back by really conservative women led by Phyllis Schlafly, who came out and said, your daughter's going to be drafted. If you pass the Equal Rights Amendment, and the draft was going when it was first passed through Congress, they're going to draft your daughter. And people weren't too fond of that. I've never been quite, fond of drafting sons, but I guess some people like daughters better than sons. Anyway, I like them all and don't like the draft. And I just have always thought what was interesting about this subject is that Phyllis Schlafly was right, 100% right, except even without the Equal Rights Amendment, if a draft comes, they're going to draft your daughter just like your son. And it'll be interesting to see what happens as to whether they have to force equal amounts of women into the front lines as they would men. Of course, the reality, if you step back, is that the military doesn't need the draft. Warfare isn't becoming more manpower intensive. It's becoming dramatically less. With drones and with the, if you've ever seen a Star Wars movie, with the ability to have like all kinds of drones and robots with artificial intelligence, the future doesn't look like we need to draft a lot of people and put them into uniform and put a pack on their back and send them around the world. And of course, I'd question the whole foreign policy that even today has bases and soldiers and interventions all over the world, and what my favorite Democrat, Tulsi Gabbard, calls regime change wars. So, but it's interesting that Schlafly was raising this alarm, but we already have the 14th Amendment and equal protection under the law, and that applies to women and men. And of course, I was very much resisting draft registration when Jimmy Carter brought it back in 1980, when Ronald Reagan promised he would end it if elected president, and then kind of went back on his word and prosecuted people like myself. And the program was taken all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court on the grounds of that it discriminated against men, and that if it didn't include women, it would violate our rights and should be thrown out. And the Supreme Court said, somewhat reasonably, overall, their decisions on the draft have been horrible, because it's obviously violates the 13th Amendment. It's involuntary servitude. But they said here, women can't be in combat. The draft is designed to deliver combat soldiers. And since women can't be in combat, it would make no sense to draft women. Now, of course, they would intend to draft women if they were drafting healthcare workers or something else, which is not, once you start conscripting people, you can come up with all kinds of rationales for who should and under what circumstances. But so it's not like they forswore ever, going after conscripting women, but they weren't going to use it in a military draft sort of way. You fast forward 4 decades, and of course, women are now able to go into and in virtually every combat field, every combat position. So that's no longer true. And the federal judge last year, I believe it was, early last year, or was it this year? I'm losing my mind. But a federal judge has basically said, look, your draft registration program is unconstitutional because it violates the rights of men. Women should be included in every way that men should, because that whole combat thing is completely changed. So we know that soon they're either going to extend draft registration to women, or they're going to end the program. And of course, we've talked previously, and we'll talk again about the draft and draft registration and the whole ridiculous program that there is no need for. But here, it's interesting that because of equal protection of the laws and the way society has changed, that Schlafly was right that the draft might, or that the Equal Rights Amendment might force this, but it's obvious you didn't need the Equal Rights Amendment, because just equal rights and changing military policy has created the same circumstance. And it's important to look at that, because it means that while the Equal Rights Amendment, I read it, it seems to make sense. I seem to agree with it in every way, shape, and form. But as you and I have discussed, how are we going to define the word sex? And is everybody going to see that the same way? And interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons why you debate these things and you hold votes and discussions, and in essence, when I feel like Marco Rubio. Anyway, in essence, here it was debated back in the 1970s, but there was a different concept, I think, of a lot of things. You didn't have, like, conservatives already raised concerns, and I think in some cases rightfully so, about transgender athletes taking positions of women. And of course, if there can't be any account of sex in terms of deciding positions, well, then you don't have to be a transgender. You can just be a man and say, hey, I'm going to run this race that the women are running. Now, I don't think a reasonable court would interpret that constitutional amendment that way, but let's debate it and let's see what might come of it. And let's not rush it into the Constitution, especially in a way, in this day and age, this is simple enough stuff that let's put it back through the process, and let's not say that we can just, even though the time has expired, what the heck, we're gonna ratify it and shove it in anyway. That's not likely to work well.
You should mention how they're attempting to bum rush it in.
Well, basically, in 1972, they passed it. They gave it a 7-year time period for ratification. And I always, when I say that and think about it, is when I was working for term limits, they brought constitutional amendments. Here's the constitutional amendment. We were wanting to make sure we got one in that was 3 terms in the House and 2 in the Senate and had lifetime limits and good stuff and written right. And they always had this little clause that said, ratification within 7 years of passage. And I thought, well, what if they don't ratify within 7 years? I'd like to have 10 or 20, or do we have to have any limit at all? And of course, the last constitutional amendment, the Madison Amendment, was proposed as part of the Bill of Rights. There were 12 elements to that. 10 of them got passed, 2 didn't. And the one one of the ones that didn't was then ratified 203 years later, in what was it, 1991 or I believe it was 1991 or 1992, on pay. And that's one of the reasons that people are saying, well, now we can just push through the Equal Rights Amendment because this one took 203 years. Why should there be any time limit? Well, the Madison Amendment, the ones that Madison proposed didn't have a time limit. And that's why that one has been added to the Constitution. The Equal Rights Amendment did. And of course, then it was extended. And as I understand it, it was extended by a majority vote of Congress, which is not the 2/3 that proposes amendments. But either way, it was extended until 1982. And then it's still not enough states ratified it. 35 states ratified it. 5 states rescinded their ratification after Phyllis Schlafly and other activists, went after it. And so you could argue that only 30 states have done it, but there's some question about whether rescinding votes should count. And I think that, certainly if they came before it was actually ratified by enough states, they should count. But either way, 2 states since that time, in very recent times, I think in the last, 4 or 5 years, Nevada and Illinois have now ratified it. And so if you don't count the states that rescinded it, that would be 37. And with Virginia now turning blue, both chambers of the legislature this November, just weeks ago, voting and putting in a Democratic majority in both the House and Senate, they can ratify it, and that would be 38 states. But of course, the deadline has run out. It ran out, 37 years ago. If I'm right, it's tough across the millennial things there, but anyway, it just seems to me it's very bad politics. It's a simple concept. Americans don't, for the most part, disagree about equal rights for men and women. Put it forward in some way that could unite the country, not like, wearing hoods and late at night sneaking into the, National Archives and sticking it in or something. This is it. The time has run out. Put it back through the process. Let's discuss the concerns anybody has, and let's pass it. I think I'd vote for it, but I'd want to have a discussion. I'd want something to be on the record that the way that I understand the terminology is the way that the authors understand the terminology, and that we can put that in the record, and that a court of law could look at it and say, okay, here's obviously the parameters that were intended by these words that are being used. Look, interpreting law is tough, but human beings really can do it if they try. But you have to have some process, and you have to have some respect for the people, enough respect that you don't try some end run like this. I think this is, and I know the media, it just cheerleads for it. There doesn't seem to be any real criticism over trying to do something that I think just takes away from people's confidence in government and in having some rule of law. If basically people can try to jam a constitutional amendment through that has already expired in its timeline, and that's barely a blip in any of the stories. It's just, yes, they can kind of, and if we cheerlead it enough and we just pass it anyway, we can kind of ignore that. It sets people who want to see that equal rights amendment up to be very disappointed when it doesn't happen. It sets up people who are on the other side to say, my goodness, I can't trust anything. Who knows what they'll do next? We need to let's talk. We need to get together and talk about maybe having a process that there could just be enough trust to know that when the time runs out for something, it's out, and you can bring it back, but you have to bring it back. It just seems so simple.
When I was young, we're about the same age, when it was talking about it a great deal in the late 70s and early 80s, I became dubious about the amendment, largely because I didn't think that Americans any longer agreed on what rights were and what a basic right. But as one of your loyal readers, Pat, says on the website today, we don't know much about sex anymore. We can't agree about sex because there is this concept of gender, which was not a big deal in 1982.
Yes. And I do look at things like that you've got transgender women who are biologically men competing in sports and stuff. And I look at that, and it's just not so much on the basis of gender or sex, but on the basis of sport. I want sports to be, fun to watch and interesting. You want it to be competitive. You don't want it to be unfair, and that's no fun. But there is a different discussion that needs to be had. And again, that we can have that discussion. I know we can figure all this stuff out. We can be good to all people and welcoming, and let's give everybody their rights. And boy, if there's a conflict of rights someplace, let's drill down and figure out why we have a conflict there. I mean, this isn't stuff that we can't do. It's somewhat new. But that's the way the world is. It makes it more exciting that it's not always the same issues. There's new issues. Let's deal with them. It seems to me though that there's almost an attempt to say no. Let's jam in that we win or you win, or nobody wins in that sort of thing. Passing a constitutional amendment that we would then fight over later doesn't seem to solve any of those problems. The truth is, a discussion without passing a constitutional amendment might solve most of the problems. I mean, because I think about it, and I think there's sometimes this, and I saw it with Caitlyn Jenner, Bruce Jenner, Olympic superstar athlete, becomes a transgender woman, and it was big news, and I think nobody really cared. Great for hey, more power to you. Live the life you want to live. I really think there was not a lot of the country that, what's the big deal? And I think there's been, but I'm sure there are people who have a lot of trouble. I think there are people who almost think that, that this is just all something that's people in cities are putting over on them. It's all not really true or something. They don't know anyone who's transgender. I find that hard to believe that they've never bumped into anybody who was transgender, but it's depending on where you live and so on. You can these folks are going to have their opinions. They can have their rights. Transgender people can have their rights. I don't see that there's really going to be that much of disagreement over these things, except in who's dictating for somebody else. And the less we have to dictate, it's why when the bathroom policy came out, it was, anarchy has worked so well. This is, I don't know about you, but I've gone to the bathroom my whole life. And I've just never had any real problems. When you stop and think, it's one of the things that works pretty well in the United States. It doesn't matter where you are. There's bathrooms everywhere. And we figured out how to make those bathrooms, and be able to come in and out. And I've never thought about checking the ID of anybody who went in and out. I've never had any problems in bathrooms. I have heard of some, but that's a whole nother case. No, it's the sort of thing that, I make light of how silly I think a lot of this is, but there are discussions to be had, and it's not just that we kind of are politically going to push different things. We're not going to have those discussions. That's not how you have those discussions. That's not how you bring people together, by trying to somehow pass this amendment. And maybe the people pushing it, that's not their goal to somehow, it doesn't have anything to do for them with transgender rights, because of course when it was discussed 30, 40 years ago, it didn't have anything to do with that. But whatever it has to do with, go through the process. And I think it's tough to tell people that today, because they see the process and they see that for the most part, when we get to see, and we had a couple things that were kind of about impeachment and some of that, we haven't talked that much about it, and won't be really, because there's plenty of it in the media, I've noticed, and for the most part, I don't think that's where the important decisions in our society are being made. But when we see discussions being had in living color on our TV sets, we're not very impressed. It's not the kind of discussions we'd like to see. And we got to change that. And I think this Equal Rights Amendment, it's just kind of a silly thing, because it's not likely to happen and it's not really needed. And yet I think it could be a good discussion, and there may be parts of it needed, but in raising the red flag or the blue flag, we're not ever going to, they don't seem to be intent on taking it to the body politic in any reasonable, respectful way and saying, okay, let's try this. And surely, if they're saying we couldn't get an equal rights amendment that merely says men and women are equal under the law and written to solve anybody else's problem, if we can't agree on that as a society, if we can't write that up, that's pretty bad. And I'm not arguing that we have to. We've already written it up in the 14th Amendment. We could do it other ways too. We could, we could add language. We could say, we could define terms more. But if folks think that the best way to get that done is this end run, after time has run out and everybody's left the stadium, we're going to call a couple plays and see if we can get it across the end line. That that just negates the whole idea that we have, that we're respectful of our fellow citizens and that we have some confidence that given a way to make the world better, people are going to agree. And that's something so simple that I think I don't know, I haven't seen any polls, but men and women ought to be equal under the law. I got to think that's in the mid to high 90s.
Yeah, the problem is that many people don't understand the equality of rights under the law. My argument always was that the language was fine with me, but it's not as if when you say equality of rights shall not be abridged on account of sex. Like, isn't that how it read? When you say that, it does not mean that something new is being added to rights. We're just recognizing that this is an element of the rights we've already had, and it's really just a gloss, because to me, what I fear in this with the people who are talking about gender rather than sex is that they're trying to force people to include rather than to allow freedom of association. And I fear that that's what's going on, and that's what many people are concerned about now too, about this kind of stuff, is that we have a bunch of people who aren't interested in freedom as defining rights, but instead as forcing people to do something they don't want.
They want to order society the way they think society should be, and certainly, freedom of association kind of gets lost. You don't hear freedom of the press and freedom of speech, but freedom of association is big, and this may not be the best example from a PR standpoint, because people get so exercised over the idea that corporations are not people, they're corporations. But of course, corporations are comprised of people freely associating with each other. And you can write different rules. Corporations are creatures of law and government, and they were legislated into existence, and they can be changed, or you could legislate them out of existence. I don't think any sane person wants to go that direction, but it seems to me the idea that people have a right to associate with each other is huge, because freedom of speech without it would be shouting in the wilderness. Freedom of the press without it would be the same. You can run someplace on the moon and do your newspaper and stand on a soapbox, but if you can't actually associate with people, and you think about around the world associating, when governments say, we're going to lob tear gas every time that you get together anywhere, which is happening not only in Hong Kong now, but also in Baghdad, a government that we control. Where 300 plus people have been killed by security forces in Iraq in the last few months. I believe that wounded is something like 15,000. They have used live ammunition. They have killed people by shooting them in the head with tear gas canisters, but they're demanding rights. And I don't know every demand that's been made on the street in Baghdad, but the people aren't too happy with their government there, and I think they have every reason to be. They're not too happy with their government. They're not too happy with Iran, which is largely embedded in their government, and they're not too happy with the United States of America, which is largely standing behind and defending their government and making it, well, I mean, we're their bad cop if they get into trouble. And not only do I not like that, but I also think here we are. I know I've just jumped into this big tangent, but here we are in America. We have invaded a country, set up a government. That government is killing people on the streets using live ammunition against what appear to be mostly peaceful protesters. And whatever that line is, I'm not sure shooting rifles with live bullets I'm not sure that's the proper response. And yet there's no discussion really in America about any responsibility we might have for the monster we have created in Iraq. Just none. And that's really amazing. It's we you hear, anytime someone makes a change like Trump, and I don't think I would have done it the way he did it in terms of pulling out at the time he did in Syria, and you've got the Kurds, and you got different things that could be raised. But you hear all the problems at that point of what it means to not continue our intervention in Syria. But not one bit is really, I mean, I just don't think it comes home to people that what's going on the streets of Baghdad is our responsibility. We created those conditions. We put people there. We put the government there that's killing people. And it's kind of, I look at Venezuela and I think, the government of Cuba has some responsibility for what's happening to people on the streets of Venezuela. And I think in the same way, we have some responsibility for what's happening to people on the streets of Baghdad.
Well, that seems undoubtable. I don't know how you could disagree, but I'm sure somebody does. But you have to admit, we in America have problems with our own little governments. In Massachusetts on Monday, you wrote about how the Massachusetts legislature wants to take away people's cars and boats, cars, boats, and whatever, conveyances, if they can't prove that the vaping product they have is legal.
Yes. There's finally been just a little bit of sense on the drug war and marijuana. And Massachusetts has now legalized marijuana, and then some realization that we were going the wrong direction. And what's the first impulse? First of all, on all this vape stuff, it's and look, I don't smoke cigarettes. Once upon a time I did. I'm glad I gave them up. It was long ago. I kind of think I've encouraged loved ones I know, and I don't anymore, but at one point encouraged them to vape instead of smoke because I think it's healthier for you. But neither one of them's good. No, when my parents' generation would always say, well, we didn't know all the dangers of smoking. But I'm thinking, you're sucking smoke. I mean, no one stands around a fire and breathes in and tries to grab all the smoke. Everyone really, you cough the first couple of times. That's kind of a telltale sign that it's not good for you. And somehow breathing in, mist and different chemicals, that doesn't sound good either. But as a way to get nicotine into your nicotine addicted body, maybe vaping is better than smoking cigarettes. That was my sense. But you look at the problems with it, and almost all the problems have been using THC, which is, of course, unregulated in vaping. It's illegal. Not using the products that most of the big companies are producing and so on. So you're using kind of black market products in the vaping thing, and then they run into problems. And that has not, all the hype is kind of, I think, hidden that. But whatever, even if you're going to be insane about vaping, what is the first thing it seems like that the Massachusetts legislature wants to jump to is that we're going to use civil asset forfeiture against people. And if they can't prove their vaping products, like you say, they're going to grab their car or their boat. Or this is, our government is constantly doing things like this that just say they don't have good sense. They don't, Andy Griffith is dead. It's like the idea that maybe there should be some restraint and some common sense, that we don't live in a police state or shouldn't. And yet you hear these things constantly, that somehow police should just, be completely oppressive. And that is, we should be able to steal and beat up people. Trump has suggested that at the rally, saying that he would pick up somebody's legal fees if they punch somebody, or that the police used to, beat somebody up a little bit, and that might teach him a lesson. We don't need those police. I mean, we have to kind of decide as a society, to virtue signal by making police behave themselves, by making government actually do the right thing. It just seems like for so long there have been these sorts of policies that 90% of us, I was shocked, and in a good way, to see the polling on civil asset forfeiture. And the same's true with police cameras and others, but especially civil asset forfeiture. People understand and oppose the sort of violation that is to people's property rights, to criminal justice rights, to innocence until proven guilty. And the numbers are 88 and 92% against that policy. And yet it continues. They keep doing it, and they're in Massachusetts suggesting that they do it all over again. What that tells you is there's a disconnect. We're not in control. They're not looking at the polls and saying, hey, what do the people want? Because, boy, we want to do what they want. We work for them, and they don't like civil asset forfeiture. We need to find a different way to raise revenue. No, they're saying, those people may have said something, not that I really care. Whatever it is, we're doing what we want to do with the folks who we work with, the insiders or cronies, or just the people we work with. But the public be damned on these things. I mean, when you see things like this, and I've said the same thing about term limits, but you can understand on term limits that politicians, okay, on this one, we're going to say, screw you. We're going to do what's good for us. We don't care. We're not going to pass term limits, because that would hurt us personally really bad. We'd have to leave our fine positions. But on civil asset forfeiture, I mean, how important, this isn't life or death to elected officials. What this is that the police unions and the prosecutors and other folks are going to say, hey, we'd like this money we're getting. And the public, they know the public's against it, but they figure, I'm going to get reelected. I'm going to do what my buddies want. So not just when it's about them getting to stay in power, on all kinds of things. And that civil asset forfeiture continues in this country. It's outrageous, but we see on all kinds of things. The thing that people, I think, have to come to grips with is that we've lost control of our government. We have lost control. We're not losing control. We've lost control. And so, in essence, as a friend once recently told me, we're behind enemy lines. It's a little bit like that. We don't have the clout we ought to have. But it is time to step up. When people do start to step up, wow, that it can change fast. And I say that because in a state like Virginia, years ago, we had a legislation passed about abusive driver fees. And the fees were these extras that were added to tickets not parking tickets, but speeding, those sorts of tickets, and traffic tickets, but active active tickets, and they were to go after abusive drivers. But of course, they very quickly in the public mind were abusive fees, abusive driver fees, but abusive fees because they were talking about charging people like $3,000. And it turned out they had a special exemption that if you weren't from the state of Virginia, they wouldn't charge you. The reason being, if they did, states would go to court and the federal government would shut it down, saying it violated interstate compacts, that you can't have these types of abusive fees on people. Highway robbery, don't ever come to our state again because a bunch of police stopped you and slapped you with, $15,000 in fees because you did 2 or 3 things you weren't supposed to do. And so here in Virginia, what are we going to do? We can't take it to a referendum. There was an election coming up, but not terribly quickly. And a guy put up a website with a petition calling on him to take these down. I believe, there were 75,000 people who had signed it when I got to it, which was just days after it started, it seemed. And in the end, I believe there were several 100,000 people who signed this. But the response using that vehicle and other ways to show protest was so great that the sponsor of it said he would move in the next session of the legislature to repeal his bill, repeal it outright, and they did. And he survived, I believe, as I recall, but a number of legislators went down after that. It's, we still have the power, just like in revolutions all over the world, when Czechs poured into the streets of Prague, it ended there. But of course, there was all kinds of things that led up to that. And we still have the power, but if we don't exercise it, it's getting weaker, not stronger. And it's only going to get stronger if we exercise it.